Okay, so I want to do a review of illusion of depth and talk to you about how that applies to Impressionism. So this is the landscape photo reference that I'm using for my project. And so illusion of depth methods that are going to come into play are atmospheric perspective. Atmospheric perspective is something that always comes into play with landscapes that have depth in them. And so areas that are further away are going to have kind of a blue purplish cast over them. And so you can kind of see that, like how the water kind of feeds into the sky, and then also how this kind of has like a kind of light blue haze, and that's just like the buildup of water particles suspended in the air over a distance create that effect. And so things that are in the distance will have kind of a bluish glow to them. Then something else that you're going to notice just looking at your photograph is that things that are closer are going to have much more detail. So even in the photograph, like this is much more punchier, detailed. And then this further away gets kind of softer, and it kind of gets softer and softer as it gets further away. And so that's something that we want to think about when we're creating our piece. And then color and contrast. Colors are going to be punchier, more saturated in the foreground. There's going to be more contrast between like dark shadows and bright highlights than in the distance, where it's going to be more middle tone values, and the colors will be less saturated. Overlap, things that are in front of other things will overlap those things. Size, things that are in the foreground are proportionately larger than things in the distance. And then perspective, we don't really have linear perspective in here, but you can kind of see things kind of going back in space, kind of like perspective, but perspective applies more to things like architecture, as you recall. Placement, things that are further away are going to be higher on the page than things that are closer, which will be typically lower on the page. So that's just a quick review of the different illusion of depth methods and kind of showing you how they apply to my landscape. Your landscape is, different, and things might be slightly different than what I talked about, but a lot of these things do apply across the board. Okay, so the next thing that we want to do with our project is we want to start to build depth, and also just kind of add more layers of color on here by thinking about shadows and how we're going to mix those with color. And so some things to think about are what are the darkest values that you have available to you. So I have like some dark blues and some dark purples. I also have a dark brown. Dark brown and dark blue makes a really nice shadow tone. And having those darker colored pencils available is good. You cannot use black. The Impressionists didn't use black. The other thing that I want to think about is color intensity. And when I want to lower the intensity of a color to create like a shadow area, or just to make the color of the pencil less bright for the subject in the piece, you can add the colors complement, okay? Mix together the complements. And so when you look at the color wheel, you want to look for colors across from each other. So if you have an area that has green, okay, and you have a shadow area, or the green is just too bright in that area and you want to kind of lower the contrast, you can add a little bit of red to it. And so mixing a little bit of red is going to make the green less bright. Same thing with any of the colors. So if you have an area that is violet, and you need to lower the contrast, you would add a little bit of yellow, or vice versa. Blue, there might be some areas kind of in the distant water where I add a little bit of orange into the blue to lower the contrast so it is not so bright. And so we want to think about complements, and then we also want to think about creating darker areas to build form, and then also build depth in form and in the illusion of depth throughout the piece, and just kind of bring the whole thing up at once. Okay, so I start working from the top down. That just helps to keep me from smearing my artwork in places, and it also helps me to think about that illusion of depth. The furthest thing should be highest up on the page. That's where things should be softer and kind of more muddled in detail, and also where the colors should be kind of less contrasty. So I'm just kind of adding some more blue tones to the sky there. Okay, and then I'm like working on the horizon. I do add a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of orange in there to desaturate the blue a little bit. So orange is the complement of blue, and I want to make the blue not as bright, and so adding a tiny bit of orange is going to help to desaturate that. I know it feels kind of funny to do something like that, but it's a good color theory thing to apply. Okay, and then I'm just kind of blocking in some more here and adding some depth to the water and defining the water line. Now I'm going to go ahead and add some red in where the green is going to go for those distant trees, because back in there it should be kind of more neutralized. The color should be less contrasty. And so I am adding red to the green to again desaturate it. Okay, and then I'm going to work my way through the rocks and use kind of this dark blue violet to map out the shadows. Okay, so I went through and I took the violet and I blocked in the shadows in the rocks. And so that's adding depth to the form. It's making the forms look more, starting to work on the three-dimensional part of those forms. And you'll see that as I get closer to the foreground and I work more there, I am adding more pressure and more detail with the application of my colored pencil, because I want the foreground to really pop. I want it to be dark darks, bright highlights with contrast. And then I'm just kind of working around, adding the green in now, adding, just kind of building up more, blocking in, and then also adding more depth with blocking in the shadows this time. Okay, so now reflect and think about how you can approach this with your landscape, working top to bottom, furthest thing in the distance to closest thing in the photograph, adding depth to the shadows, so working in your dark areas with probably a cool tone, darker valued colored pencil, adding some complements into shadow areas or places where you need the color to be less saturated, and then just kind of like generally blocking things in a little bit more, but working very general, not very specific yet, but punching in more contrast in the foreground, less contrast in the background.